The dusty road stretched endlessly into the horizon, the summer heat rising off the asphalt in shimmering waves. On this barren stretch of highway, there was little to mark civilization, save for a solitary truck-stop diner, Mason's Grill. The sign above its weathered facade flickered intermittently, its neon glow fighting against years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint trace of motor oil that clung to the truckers who frequented the place. This was a haven for those passing through a pit stop between long hauls and endless journeys. It wasn't the kind of place where anything extraordinary happened, at least not until today. The clock above the counter read 3:15 p.m. It was that quiet hour when the lunch rush had ended, and the evening crowd had yet to roll in. Behind the counter, Emily Carter, a 27-year-old waitress with sharp features and dark, piercing eyes, moved with practiced efficiency. She was used to the rhythms of this place, the steady flow of orders, the gruff politeness of regulars, and the occasional newcomers who drifted through like tumbleweeds. She was polite but distant, her guard always slightly raised. Life in a remote place like this didn't afford her the luxury of naivety. Emily paused to wipe a smudge from the counter, her gaze flicking toward the man sitting in the corner booth. Ethan Graves, her boyfriend of 2 years, sat nursing a cup of black coffee. He was lean and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. His weathered leather jacket hung over the back of his chair, and a well-worn paperback lay open on the table in front of him. His eyes, a cold steel grey, scanned the page lazily, but Emily knew better. Ethan wasn't reading, he was watching. He always was. It was a habit he couldn't shake, not after everything he'd been through. Ethan had the air of a man who didn't belong, as though the dusty truck stop and its tired patrons were mere background noise to something larger. His past was a mystery to most, and he intended to keep it that way. Even Emily only knew fragments. A former operative in an elitary unit, he had left that life behind for reasons he rarely discussed. She respected his privacy, but there were moments, fleeting and rare, when she caught glimpses of the man he used to be. The way he moved, the way his eyes darted to exits and blind spots, it was like he was always preparing for something, even when there was no threat in sight. The door to the diner creaked open, the small bell above it jangling with a metallic chime. 3 men strode in, their heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor. They were hard to miss, leather-clad, tattooed and reeking of gasoline and sweat. The Iron Fangs, a notorious biker gang that had been terrorizing small businesses and truck stops in the region for months. The leader, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek, glanced around the diner with the casual arrogance of a predator surveying its territory. His name was Carl Bulldog Graves, and his reputation preceded him. Behind Bulldog were 2 of his cronies, Red, a wiry man with a patchy beard and a nervous energy that made him seem like he was constantly on edge, and Tank, a massive brute with arms like tree trunks and a cruel grin that rarely left his face. As the trio moved deeper into the diner, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations died down, forks clinked softly against plates, and the few patrons present avoided eye contact. Even the grizzled truckers who usually laughed off trouble seemed to tense, their gazes lowering to their coffee cups. Emily stiffened when she saw them, her hand tightening on the rag she'd been using to clean. Bulldog's eyes locked onto her immediately, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He sauntered toward the counter, his heavy boots scuffing the floor with each deliberate step. Well, Bulldog drawled, leaning against the counter. "Ain't this a pretty sight? Looks like we hit the jackpot, boys. Red chuckled nervously, while Tank grunted in agreement. Emily forced herself to remain calm, her voice steady but clipped. What can I get for you? Bulldog's grin widened. How about a smile to go with that coffee, sweetheart? Or is customer service not your thing? Ethan didn't move from his booth, but his eyes lifted from the book, locking onto Bulldog. He didn't say a word, didn't so much as flinch, but the air around him seemed to change. Emily glanced toward him, a flicker of concern crossing her face. She knew Ethan well enough to recognize the warning signs, the subtle shift in his posture, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. I'll get your coffee, she said curtly, turning toward the pot behind the counter. As she poured, Bulldog leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. You know, a girl like you shouldn't be working in a dump like this. You ever think about upgrading your situation? I could make that happen. Emily set the coffee down in front of him with a hard clink, meeting his gaze with a cold glare. I'm fine where I am. Anything else? Bulldog's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a glimmer of irritation. He straightened, towering over the counter. You've got a sharp tongue, sweetheart. Someone have to teach you some manners. Before Emily could respond, Ethan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She said she's fine. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward the corner booth, where Ethan sat with his hands folded casually on the table. His voice had been quiet, almost calm, but there was an edge to it that made even the air seem heavier. Bulldog turned slowly, his grin returning as he sized up the man who dared to interrupt him. Well, look who's got a backbone, Bulldog sneered. You her boyfriend or something? Ethan didn't answer. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and stepped away from the booth. The room seemed to shrink as he approached, his presence somehow eclipsing Bulldog's considerable size. When he spoke again, his voice was even, but there was no mistaking the threat beneath it. You're done here. Pay for the coffee and leave. Bulldog laughed, the sound loud and grating in the confined space. You've got some balls, I'll give you that. But I think you're confused about how this works. See, I don't take orders from. Ethan moved so quickly that it took a moment for anyone to process what had happened. In a single fluid motion, he grabbed Bulldog's wrist, twisting it sharply. The biker let out a pained grunt as the coffee cup clattered to the floor. Before anyone could react, Ethan stepped closer, his voice a low growl. I said, "You're done." The other bikers froze, their hands hovering near their belts. Red looked like he might bolt, while Tank's fists clenched at his sides. But Bulldog, despite the pain etched across his face, managed a defiant snarl. You don't know who you're messing with, pal. Ethan released Bulldog's wrist, letting him stumble back a step. I know exactly who you are. The question is, do you know who I am? For a moment, the room held its breath. Bulldog glared at Ethan, rubbing his wrist, before finally jerking his head toward the door. Let's go, he snapped, his voice dripping with barely contained fury. This ain't over. As the bikers stormed out, the tension in the diner slowly eased. Emily exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly as she began cleaning up the spilled coffee. Ethan returned to his booth without a word, picking up his book as though nothing had happened. But Emily knew better. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The long shadows of the afternoon sun stretched across the parking lot of Mason's Grill, where the dust from the departing bikers' motorcycles still hung faintly in the air. Inside, the diner was quiet again, but the tension lingered like a spectre. Emily wiped the counter with mechanical precision, her mind racing through the events of the last half hour. Her hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline of the encounter still coursing through her veins. She stole a glance at Ethan, who sat calmly in his booth, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. That was his way, she reminded herself, steady, unshakable, and always in control. But she knew him well enough to recognize the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Ethan hadn't just stepped in to protect her. He had done what he always did: assessed the situation, taken control, and neutralized the threat. Yet this time felt different. These men weren't just troublemakers looking for a quick thrill, they were dangerous. Their leader, Bulldog, had radiated a level of menace that went beyond idle threats. And the way he'd left, with those parting words, "This ain't over," left a chill in her chest. Ethan finally set down his coffee cup, the ceramic making a soft clink against the table. His steel-grey eyes met Emily's, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The unspoken weight of the situation hung between them, heavy and unrelenting. "They'll be back, won't they?" Emily asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Yes." The simplicity of his answer sent a shiver down her spine. There was no doubt in his tone, no attempt to reassure her with false hope. That wasn't his style. Ethan believed in facing reality head-on, no matter how grim it might be. And right now, reality was staring them both in the face. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of fear and determination. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "We prepare." Emily frowned. "Prepare for what?" "Ethan, this is a diner, not whatever you're used to. We're not equipped to deal with people like them." "We don't need to be," he replied calmly. "I'll handle it." The confidence in his voice should have been reassuring, but instead, it only deepened her unease. She knew Ethan's background, at least in broad strokes. He had spent years as a Delta Force operative, a soldier trained for the most dangerous and high-stakes missions imaginable. He had seen and done things that most people couldn't even fathom. But this wasn't a war zone. This was her home, her livelihood, and she couldn't bear the thought of it being torn apart. Before she could voice her concerns, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared in the distance. Her head snapped toward the window, her heart skipping a beat. Ethan was already on his feet, his movements fluid and purposeful. He approached the window with the measured steps of a predator stalking its prey, his eyes scanning the horizon. A single motorcycle pulled into the parking lot, kicking up a cloud of dust as it came to a stop. The rider dismounted, his leather jacket glinting in the sunlight. It wasn't Bulldog, but the man's posture and the patch on his jacket marked him as one of the Iron Fangs. He stood there for a moment, his helmet tucked under his arm, as if gauging the situation. Ethan didn't wait. He stepped out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly as it swung shut behind him. Emily watched from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the tension in the biker's stance and the calm, deliberate way Ethan held himself. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't good. After a few moments, the biker climbed back onto his motorcycle and sped off, the roar of the engine fading into the distance. Ethan stood there for a moment, his hands on his hips, his head tilted slightly as if deep in thought. When he finally came back inside, Emily was waiting for him by the counter. "What did he want?" she asked, her voice tight with apprehension. Ethan's jaw tightened. "They're coming back. All of them." Emily's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, all of them?" "Bulldog and his crew," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "They're calling in reinforcements. They want to make an example out of us." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about her or Ethan anymore. This was about the diner, the truckers who frequented it, and the small slice of normalcy it provided in an otherwise unforgiving world. The Iron Fangs weren't just coming back for revenge, they were coming to take control. "What do we do?" she asked again, her voice trembling. Ethan looked at her, his expression softening ever so softly. "Trust me." Emily wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that he could handle this, that his skills and experience would be enough to protect them. But the stakes were so much higher than anything she had ever faced before, and the thought of losing everything she had worked so hard for, losing Ethan, was almost too much to bear. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Ethan began to move with purpose. He examined the layout of the diner, taking note of every door, window, and potential vantage point. He asked Emily about the supplies they had on hand: tools, cleaning chemicals, anything that could be repurposed. She watched him work, her anxiety slowly giving way to a grudging sense of awe. He was like a machine, his mind ticking through possibilities and contingencies with a precision that was almost inhuman. By the time night fell, the diner had been transformed. The tables and chairs had been rearranged to create makeshift barricades, and the lights had been dimmed to provide better concealment. Ethan had even rigged a few surprises, improvised traps that he refused to explain in detail, but assured Emily would be effective. As they worked, the distant sound of motorcycle engines began to grow louder. Emily's hands shook as she carried a stack of plates to the kitchen, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. But Ethan's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, calm and steady. "Emily." She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Yeah?" "Go to the back room," he said. "Lock the door. Stay there until I tell you it's safe." Her instinct was to argue, to insist that she could help, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was no room for debate, no margin for error. He needed her to trust him, and for all her fear and doubt, she did. As she retreated to the back room, the roar of motorcycles grew deafening. The Iron Fangs had arrived. Emily sat on the floor, her back pressed against the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the distant sound of voices, loud and mocking, as the bikers descended on the diner. Glass shattered somewhere in the distance, and the sharp crack of wood splintering made her flinch. She wanted to cover her ears, to block out the chaos, but she forced herself to stay alert. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not now. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the noise outside continued to escalate. And then, suddenly, there was silence. The absence of sound was almost more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. Emily strained to hear, her breath caught in her throat. A single voice broke the silence, low and menacing. "Where is he?" It was Bulldog. Emily's stomach churned. She didn't know what was happening out there, but she knew Ethan wouldn't back down. He never did. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint creak of footsteps on the diner floor. And then, like a thunderclap, all hell broke loose. Shouts and curses erupted, followed by the unmistakable sounds of a struggle. Something heavy crashed to the floor, and the walls seemed to shake with the force of the impact. Emily clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to burst out of the room. She wanted to help, to do something, but she knew that leaving would only make things worse. She had to trust Ethan. She had to believe that he could handle this. The noise outside continued for what felt like an eternity, a chaotic symphony of violence and destruction. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Emily's breath hitched as she pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. The silence was deafening, every second stretching out into an eternity. And then, finally, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. "Emily," Ethan's voice called out, calm and steady. "It's over. You can come out." Her hands shook as she unlocked the door, her heart pounding in her chest. When she stepped into the diner, she froze, her eyes widening at the scene before her. The room was a mess, tables overturned, glass shattered, and the faint scent of blood hanging in the air. But Ethan stood in the center of it all, his expression as calm and unshaken as ever. Around him, the bodies of the Iron Fangs lay scattered, some groaning in pain, others unconscious. Emily's gaze met Ethan's, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe that they might just survive this. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the night as the Iron Fangs retreated, but the chaos they had left behind in Mason's grill lingered like the acrid smell of burned rubber. Emily stood near the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped a towel, trying to wipe the blood off a shattered glass panel. Her hands trembled, not from the exertion, but from the weight of the night's events. The room around her was a battlefield, overturned tables, shards of broken plates and mugs scattered across the floor, and streaks of blood on the linoleum where Ethan had taken down several bikers with calculated precision. Ethan stood in the middle of it all, untouched by the destruction. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, his body seemingly relaxed, though Emily could see the tension in his stance. His grey eyes flicked from one end of the diner to the other, scanning every corner, every crevice. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. He knew the Iron Fangs wouldn't let this humiliation stand. They would be back. And this time they'd bring the full force of their crew. They're regrouping, Ethan said finally, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. This was just a warning. Emily stopped scrubbing, her heart sinking. A warning. Ethan, they trashed the diner and tried to kill you. What more could they possibly do? They didn't commit, Ethan said, his tone matter of fact. Bulldog's smart. He wanted to see how I'd respond, test my limits. This was just an opening move. Next time he won't hold back. Emily sank into one of the few upright chairs, her hands shaking as she buried her face in them. She couldn't believe this was happening. Her entire life, Mason's Grill had been a place of safety, a sanctuary for weary travelers and locals alike. Now, it felt like a trap, a magnet for danger. "We have to call the police," she said, her voice muffled. Ethan crouched down in front of her, his steady gaze meeting hers. "They won't help. You saw how they reacted last time. They'll file a report, maybe send a squad car to drive by once or twice, but they won't do anything that puts them at risk." Emily lifted her head, her eyes blazing with frustration. "So what? We just sit here and wait for them to come back and finish the job?" "No," Ethan said firmly. "We get ready." He stood, his commanding presence filling the room. Emily watched as he moved with purpose, stepping over broken glass and debris as if it wasn't even there. He grabbed a broom and handed it to her, his expression softening just enough to show he understood how overwhelmed she felt. "Start cleaning up," he said. "We're going to need every inch of this place in working order." "For what?" she asked, her voice shaky. "For a fight," Ethan replied. While Emily reluctantly began to sweep up the mess, Ethan moved to the storage room at the back of the diner. He opened the door and flicked on the light, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with cleaning supplies, spare chairs, and a hodgepodge of tools. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Ethan rummaged through the shelves, pulling out anything that could be repurposed: duct tape, a box of nails, industrial-strength cleaning chemicals. His mind worked like a machine, calculating every possibility, every scenario. He knew the Iron Fangs would come back with more men, more weapons, and a plan to overwhelm him. He couldn't afford to underestimate them, not again. When he returned to the main room, Emily was stacking chairs against the wall, her movements robotic. She glanced at him as he dropped the supplies onto a table, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Setting up defenses," Ethan replied, his hands already at work. He began by reinforcing the windows, using the nails and duct tape to create crude barricades. It wouldn't stop the bikers, but it might slow them down, buy him a few extra seconds when the time came. He checked the locks on the doors, tightening the screws and adding a metal rod across the back door to prevent it from being forced open. As he worked, Emily couldn't help but watch him. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he moved, precise, deliberate, and utterly focused. It was as if he was in his element, like he had done this 100 times before. And maybe he had. "What's the plan?" Emily asked, setting down the stack of chairs. Ethan didn't look up from his work. "We make this place a hard target. They're expecting us to be scared, disorganized. If we can hold them off long enough, they'll start to doubt themselves. That's when we strike." "We," she echoed, her voice rising slightly. "Ethan, I'm not a soldier. I can't do what you do." "You don't have to," he said, finally looking at her. "I just need you to be my eyes and ears. Stay in the back room, watch the security cameras, and let me know where they're coming from. Can you do that?" Emily hesitated, her mind racing with doubts. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that he could protect them both. But the odds seemed insurmountable. The Iron Fangs weren't just a gang, they were a force of nature, a storm that swept through everything in its path. "I'll try," she said finally. "That's all I need," Ethan replied. The hours ticked by as they worked side by side, transforming the diner into a fortress. Ethan rigged the kitchen with makeshift traps, using the cleaning chemicals to create improvised smoke bombs and slippery surfaces that would disorient anyone who tried to breach it. He set up mirrors in strategic locations, giving him a clear line of sight to every entrance. Meanwhile, Emily gathered supplies in the back room, first aid kits, bottled water, anything they might need if things went south. She found an old radio tucked away on a shelf and brought it to Ethan, who inspected it with a nod of approval. "Good find," he said. "This'll let us communicate if we get separated." By the time they finished, the diner looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Emily stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed as she surveyed their handiwork. "Do you really think this will work?" she asked. Ethan's lips quirked into a faint smile. "It's not about whether it works. It's about making them think twice." As if on cue, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines reached their ears. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the window, her eyes wide with panic. "They're here," she whispered. Ethan moved to her side, his expression calm and unflinching. "Go to the back room," he said. "And remember, trust me." Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded and hurried to the back. She locked the door behind her and took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The small monitor on the desk flickered to life, showing grainy footage from the security cameras Ethan had installed. She could see the Iron Fangs pulling into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen. Bulldog was at the head of the pack, his scarred face twisted into a snarl. He dismounted his bike and barked orders to his crew, who fanned out across the lot with practiced precision. Emily grabbed the radio and pressed the button. "They're surrounding the building," she said, her voice trembling. "Let them," Ethan replied. She watched as the bikers approached, their boots crunching on the gravel. One of them tried the front door, only to find it barricaded. He shouted something to Bulldog, who waved him off and motioned toward the windows. The first biker smashed a crowbar against the glass, but instead of shattering, the window held firm, reinforced by the nails and tape. The biker cursed and tried again, with the same result. Frustration rippled through the group as they realized this wouldn't be as easy as they had hoped. Inside, Ethan waited in the shadows, his body coiled like a spring. He listened to the sounds of the bikers outside, his mind mapping their movements. When the first one finally broke through a side window and climbed inside, Ethan was ready. The biker barely had time to register his surroundings before Ethan struck, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a single, devastating blow. The biker crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Ethan dragged the body into the shadows and disappeared again, his movements silent and precise. One by one, the bikers began to breach the diner, and one by one they fell. From the back room, Emily watched the chaos unfold on the monitors, her fear mingling with awe. Ethan was a ghost, a phantom in the darkness, striking with the precision of a predator. But the iron fangs weren't giving up. Bulldog's voice boomed over the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. "Find him," he shouted. "I want that bastard's head." The fight was far from over, and as Emily clutched the radio in her trembling hands, she realized that this was only the beginning of the storm. The diner's interior was now unrecognizable, a battlefield drenched in the debris of shattered tables, overturned chairs and broken glass. The echoes of the bikers' curses reverberated through the small space, punctuated by the distant sound of more motorcycles roaring in the night. The Iron Fangs were no longer simply trying to intimidate. They were escalating, determined to crush Ethan's resistance and leave nothing but ashes behind. In the back room, Emily's breath came in shallow bursts as she monitored the grainy security footage on the outdated screen. The sight of more bikers arriving sent a chill racing down her spine. The first wave had already been chaotic enough, but now reinforcements were joining the fray, at least 10 more riders, some carrying bats, chains, and crowbars. A few even had firearms holstered at their hips. "They've got more coming," Emily said into the radio, her voice trembling but steady enough to convey the urgency. "It's not just Bulldog anymore. There are more of them, and they're armed." "Understood," Ethan's voice crackled back, calm as ever. "Stay in the back room and keep eyes on the cameras. Let me know if they try to flank through the rear." Through the static of the connection, Emily could hear faint sounds in the background, heavy footsteps, the sharp metallic clang of something being knocked over, and the muffled groans of a man who had just learned the hard way what it meant to cross Ethan Graves. Out in the main dining area, Ethan crouched behind the counter, his eyes scanning the chaos before him. The Iron Fangs were fanning out, trying to corner him. Bulldog stood near the broken front window, barking orders to his men with the authority of a battlefield commander. "Spread out." Bulldog snarled, his scarred face twisted with fury. "He's one man. Corner him, flush him out." Ethan studied the bikers' movements with the same precision he'd once used to analyze enemy positions in war zones. These men were dangerous, but they weren't disciplined. Their tactics were blunt, reliant on overwhelming numbers and brute force rather than strategy. That was their first mistake. From his position, Ethan reached for one of the makeshift traps he had prepared earlier, a small, improvised smoke bomb cobbled together from industrial cleaning supplies. He activated it and rolled it toward the group of bikers converging near the kitchen entrance. Within seconds, the device erupted, filling the air with a thick, choking cloud of acrid smoke. The bikers coughed and cursed, their visibility reduced to almost nothing. Taking advantage of the confusion, Ethan moved. He slipped through the smoke like a shadow, striking fast and hard. His fist connected with the side of one biker's head, sending the man sprawling. Another reached blindly for his weapon, but Ethan disarmed him with a swift kick before delivering a devastating elbow to the ribs. From the safety of the back room, Emily watched the chaos unfold on the security monitors. The smoke obscured much of the action, but she could still make out Ethan's silhouette moving through the haze, methodical and unstoppable. It was like watching a predator dismantle its prey, one calculated move at a time. "Two more coming in from the back door," Emily said into the radio, her voice tight with urgency. "Copy that," Ethan replied. He adjusted his position, slipping toward the rear of the diner. Sure enough, two bikers were attempting to force their way in through the back entrance, the metal rod Ethan had placed across the door proving a minor inconvenience. They were working together, one holding a flashlight while the other pried at the door with a crowbar. Ethan waited until the prying biker had wedged the door open just enough to step inside. Then he struck. The flashlight wielder barely had time to register the movement before Ethan slammed his shoulder into the man, driving him back into the wall with bone-crunching force. The crowbar-wielding biker swung wildly, but Ethan ducked the attack and countered with a vicious uppercut that sent the man crumpling to the floor. Emily's voice came through the radio again. "They're regrouping in the parking lot. Looks like Bulldog's trying to rally them." Ethan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Bulldog was no fool. He'd underestimated Ethan in the beginning, but now he was adapting, trying to bring some semblance of order to his crew. If they managed to organize a coordinated assault, things could spiral out of control quickly. Moving toward the shattered front window, Ethan crouched low, keeping himself hidden from view. Outside, Bulldog stood at the center of a growing crowd of bikers. His voice boomed over the sound of revving engines and shouted curses. "This guy thinks he's a goddamn superhero." Bulldog snarled. "We're gonna show him what happens when you mess with the Iron Fangs." The bikers roared in response, their confidence bolstered by their leader's bravado. Ethan could see the fire in their eyes, the reckless determination to crush anything in their path. But he could also see the cracks forming in their resolve. The ones who had already faced him firsthand, those who had tasted his precision and power, stood a little farther back, their gazes flickering nervously toward the diner. Ethan keyed his radio. "Emily, are the kitchen traps still active?" "Yes," she replied, "but they're only going to slow them down for a little while." "That's all I need," Ethan said. Without hesitation, he reached for another smoke bomb and lobbed it through the broken window. It landed near Bulldog's feet, erupting in a plume of thick, grey smoke. The bikers shouted in surprise, scattering as the cloud enveloped them. Ethan didn't wait to see the results. He moved quickly, circling around the side of the diner to intercept the bikers who were trying to flank through the parking lot. He found them near the dumpsters, 3 men arguing over the best approach to breach the building. Ethan acted without mercy. He took down the first man with a lightning-fast strike to the throat, silencing him before he could cry out. The second turned just in time to catch a brutal knee to the stomach, followed by a punishing blow to the temple. The third man tried to flee, but Ethan caught him by the collar and slammed him into the side of the dumpster, leaving him dazed and groaning. Back in the diner, Bulldog emerged from the dissipating smoke, his eyes blazing with rage. He barked orders to his men, urging them to regroup and press the attack. The remaining bikers began to close in on the diner, their weapons raised and their movements more cautious now. Ethan returned to the main room, his breathing steady despite the intensity of the fight. He could feel the shift in the air, the moment when the tide of battle began to turn. The bikers were still dangerous, still determined, but they were starting to doubt themselves. Through the radio, Emily's voice cut through the static. "Ethan, Bulldog's coming in. He's heading for the front door." Ethan's jaw tightened. This was it, the confrontation he had been anticipating. Bulldog wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol of the Iron Fang's power. Taking him down would shatter the gang's morale and end the fight once and for all. Positioning himself near the front of the diner, Ethan waited. The door creaked open, and Bulldog stepped inside, his massive frame filling the doorway. He held a crowbar in one hand, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "Well, look who's still standing," Bulldog sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this ends now." Ethan didn't respond. He simply stared at Bulldog, his gaze cold and unflinching. The two men squared off, the tension in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. Bulldog swung the crowbar in a wide arc, the metal whistling through the air. Ethan dodged the attack with ease, his movements fluid and controlled. The fight was brutal, a clash of raw strength against calculated precision. Bulldog fought like a man possessed, his swings wild and powerful, but Ethan was faster, his strikes landing with surgical accuracy. Finally, with a well-timed maneuver, Ethan disarmed Bulldog, sending the crowbar clattering to the floor. Before Bulldog could recover, Ethan delivered a devastating blow to his knee, forcing him to the ground. Bulldog glared up at him, his face contorted with pain and fury. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think you've won?" Ethan crouched down, his voice low and steady. "It's over when I say it's over. And right now you're done." As the remaining bikers saw their leader brought to his knees, their will to fight crumbled. One by one they began to retreat, their confidence shattered. The Iron Fangs were broken, their assault a failure. Emily emerged cautiously from the back room, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The diner was in ruins, but the fight was over. She looked at Ethan, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and admiration. "You did it," she said softly. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. For now. He knew this wasn't the end. The Iron Fangs might be defeated tonight, but the battle had only just begun. And as he stood amidst the wreckage of the diner, Ethan silently vowed to protect Emily and Mason's Grill from whatever came next. The quiet that followed the chaotic battle felt unnatural, almost oppressive, as if the air itself had yet to settle. The bikers who could still walk had limped away, dragging their defeated leader Bulldog with them. His guttural curses and promises of vengeance had echoed into the night before fading into silence. Inside the wrecked diner, Emily sat at one of the few unbroken booths, her hands clutching a coffee mug, as if it might steady the tremor in her fingers. The adrenaline of the fight had long since left her, replaced by an exhausted numbness. Ethan stood by the shattered front window, his silhouette framed by the flickering neon light of the diner's broken sign. He hadn't spoken since the bikers left, his focus entirely on the darkness beyond the parking lot. His stillness was unsettling, a coiled tension that seemed ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. "They'll come back, won't they?" Emily finally asked, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. Ethan didn't turn around. "Yes, and they'll bring everything they've got." The simplicity of his response made her stomach twist. He wasn't being dramatic or trying to scare her, he was just stating a fact. The Iron Fangs wouldn't accept this defeat. Their pride and reputation wouldn't allow it. And now that Bulldog had been humiliated in front of his crew, they'd come back with overwhelming force to erase the stain of their failure. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We prepare," Ethan said, the same unshakable calm in his tone. He finally turned to face her, his grey eyes piercing and resolute. This wasn't just about revenge. The Iron Fangs wanted control. They're part of something bigger, and this diner is just one piece of the puzzle. If we don't stop them here, they'll just keep coming. Emily frowned, her exhaustion giving way to frustration. This is a diner, Ethan. It's not a fortress. And I'm not a soldier. You don't have to be, Ethan said, stepping closer to her. But you need to trust me. I've faced worse than this. And I've come out the other side. We can win this. But I need you to stay with me. His words were steady and unwavering, but there was something else in his expression, a flicker of vulnerability. He wasn't just asking for her trust. He was asking for her to believe in him. Emily nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. Okay, what do we do? Ethan exhaled, the faintest hint of relief softening his features. First, we need to figure out what they're planning. This isn't just about beating us into submission. They're after something, and we need to know what it is. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Ethan and Emily worked to repair what they could of the diner. They cleaned up broken glass, righted overturned furniture, and reinforced the barricades Ethan had set up during the first attack. But as the hours ticked by, a sense of foreboding settled over them. Ethan spent much of the morning outside, surveying the surrounding area. The diner was isolated, with only the empty highway stretching out in both directions. It was a tactical disadvantage. There were no nearby allies, no chance for reinforcements. But it also meant the Iron Fangs would have to come at them directly. By midday, Ethan spotted something that made his gut tighten. 2 black SUVs parked on the shoulder of the highway, just within view of the diner. They weren't bikers. These vehicles were sleek, expensive, and out of place in the dusty, desert landscape. He stepped back into the diner, his jaw set. "We've got company," he said. Emily glanced up from where she was cleaning a table. "More bikers?" "No," Ethan said. "Something worse." He pulled a pair of binoculars from his duffel bag and handed them to Emily. "Take a look." She peered through the lenses, focusing on the SUVs. 2 men in suits stood outside the vehicles, their postures rigid and watchful. They looked like professionals, men accustomed to danger and prepared for it. "Who are they?" Emily asked, lowering the binoculars. "Cartel," Ethan said grimly. "The Iron Fangs aren't just a biker gang. They're working for someone bigger, and now that someone's paying attention." Emily's stomach churned. Why would the cartel care about a diner in the middle of nowhere? "They don't," Ethan said. "But they care about their network. The Iron Fangs are part of their operations: smuggling, drugs, weapons, you name it. This diner is just another link in the chain. And now we're a problem they can't ignore." The weight of his words settled over Emily like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about protecting the diner anymore. They were up against something far more dangerous, something that didn't care about collateral damage. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We stay ahead of them," Ethan said. "If they're sending scouts, it means they're planning something big. We need to be ready." The day passed in tense anticipation. The SUVs remained parked on the highway, their occupants watching the diner with unsettling intensity. Ethan kept a close eye on them, but they made no move to approach. It was a waiting game, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the next wave hit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sound of motorcycle engines shattered the fragile silence. Emily's heart leaned to her throat as she turned toward the window. A dozen bikes roared into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Ethan grabbed the radio from the counter and handed it to Emily. "Get to the back room," he said. "Stay on the cameras and keep me updated." Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded and hurried to the back. She locked the door behind her and flipped on the security monitors. The grainy footage showed the bikers dismounting, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Bulldog was among them, his face twisted with fury as he barked orders. But this time he wasn't alone. Two men in suits stepped out of the SUVs, their cold, calculating expressions a stark contrast to the biker's brash aggression. One of them carried a briefcase, while the other adjusted the cuffs of his jacket with meticulous precision. "They've got cartel backing," Emily said into the radio. Two suits just stepped in. "I see them," Ethan replied. "Keep watching. Let me know if they split up." The bikers began to spread out, circling the diner like vultures. The two cartel men stayed near the center of the parking lot, speaking quietly to Bulldog. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't good. Ethan crouched near the front window, his eyes fixed on the scene outside. He could feel the shift in the air, the tension building like a storm about to break. This wasn't just a show of force anymore. This was a coordinated assault. One of the bikers approached the diner, a crowbar in hand. He tested the front door, finding it locked. With a sneer, he swung the crowbar at the glass, but it held firm, reinforced by the barricades Ethan had set up earlier. "They're testing the barricades," Emily said. "Let them," Ethan replied. The biker swung again, and this time the glass shattered. He reached through the opening to unlock the door, but as he pushed it open, he triggered one of Ethan's traps. A concealed bucket of cleaning chemicals tipped over, dousing the man in a noxious mixture. He stumbled back, coughing and clawing at his face, while the other bikers laughed. But their amusement was short-lived. Ethan moved like a shadow, slipping through the darkness and taking down the nearest biker with a swift, silent strike. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the floor. The bikers quickly realized they were being hunted. They shouted warnings to each other, their bravado giving way to unease. In the parking lot, Bulldog's frustration boiled over. "Find him," he roared. "I don't care how long it takes, find him and end this." The cartel men exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. One of them pulled out a phone, speaking rapidly in Spanish. Emily's voice crackled over the radio. "They're calling someone. It looks serious." "Stay on it," Ethan said. The fight escalated as more bikers forced their way into the diner, their weapons raised and their movements cautious. Ethan used every advantage the environment provided, striking from the shadows and disappearing before they could retaliate. But even he couldn't hold them off forever. The cartel's involvement had changed the stakes, and Ethan knew the worst was yet to come. As he took down another biker, he glanced toward the parking lot, where the cartel men were watching with unsettling calm. "They're up to something," Ethan muttered to himself. And he was right. Moments later, the faint sound of helicopter blades reached his ears, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The cartel wasn't just sending reinforcements. They were bringing in firepower. Emily's voice came through the radio, laced with panic. "Ethan, there's a helicopter coming. What do we do?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "We adapt." The storm was far from over, and the Iron Fangs were no longer the only enemy in the fight. But Ethan wasn't about to back down. Not now, not ever. The night had turned deadly quiet, the eerie calm before an impending storm. The faint sound of helicopter blades slicing through the air grew louder, the low thrum reverberating in Ethan's chest as he crouched near the shattered front window of the diner. He scanned the horizon, his mind racing to assess the situation. This was no longer a simple gang retaliation, this was an escalation beyond anything he had anticipated. The cartel's presence had turned the fight into something far more dangerous, and now, with air support arriving, Ethan knew they were preparing to obliterate any resistance. Inside the back room, Emily sat at the security monitors, her heart pounding as she toggled between the grainy feeds. On one screen, she could see the cartel's black SUVs parked in the diner's lot, their sleek, polished exteriors gleaming under the harsh glare of the diner's flickering neon sign. Men in suits stood beside the vehicles, their expressions cold and calculating as they directed the bikers, who moved with more urgency now. On another feed, she spotted a growing cluster of iron fangs forcing their way through the rear of the diner, their crowbars and chains tearing apart the makeshift barricades Ethan had rigged. Ethan, her voice crackled over the radio. They're splitting up. Half are coming in from the back. The rest are holding position with the cartel guys. That helicopter's almost here. She paused, her voice catching. I don't know if we can hold them off. We can, Ethan replied, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. Stay focused. Keep an eye on the cameras. Let me know the moment anyone breaks through. Emily nodded. Even though he couldn't see her, she forced herself to breathe, to push past the panic clawing at her chest. Ethan had a plan, he always did. She just had to trust him, even if the odds felt impossibly stacked against them. Ethan's eyes flicked back to the bikers near the SUVs. Bulldog stood among them, his hulking frame illuminated by the headlights of the parked vehicles. His face was a mask of fury, the humiliation of their earlier defeat still fresh in his mind. Beside him, one of the cartel men, a lean, sharp-featured man in a tailored suit, was speaking into a headset, gesturing toward the diner. Ethan didn't need to hear the words to understand the intent. They were preparing for the final assault. The helicopter came into view moments later, its searchlight piercing through the darkness as it hovered over the diner. The powerful beam swept across the parking lot, illuminating the wreckage of broken bikes and scattered debris. Ethan ducked lower, his pulse quickening as he calculated his next move. The cartel wasn't just here to intimidate, they were here to end this. From the back room, Emily's voice crackled again. Ethan, they've got something big in the helicopter. I can't make it out, but it looks like a crate. Maybe weapons? Could be, Ethan muttered to himself, his mind racing. If the cartel had brought heavy firepower, they wouldn't hesitate to use it. He couldn't let them get that close. He keyed the radio. Emily, stay put. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. I'll deal with it. He moved quickly but silently, his footsteps careful as he maneuvered through the diner. He grabbed one of the improvised smoke bombs he had prepared earlier, tucking it into his jacket, and then retrieved a length of steel pipe he had reinforced with duct tape. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. As the helicopter descended lower, its rotors whipping up a cyclone of dust and debris, Ethan slipped out through the side door of the diner, sticking to the shadows. He circled around the building, keeping low, until he reached the rear lot where the bikers were massing. The harsh glow of the searchlight gave him just enough visibility to pick out their positions. 3 men near the back entrance, 2 more near the side window they had shattered earlier. They were trying to breach the diner from multiple angles, but their movements were sloppy, disorganized. Ethan moved like a phantom, his years of training kicking in as he closed the distance to the nearest biker. The man stood with his back to Ethan, a crowbar in hand as he pried at the barricaded door. Ethan struck fast and hard, the steel pipe connecting with the back of the man's knee. The biker crumpled with a grunt of pain, and before he could recover, Ethan delivered a swift blow to the side of his head, knocking him unconscious. The other 2 bikers near the rear door heard the commotion and turned, their weapons raised. One of them charged, swinging a chain with brutal force, but Ethan sidestepped the attack and countered with a precise strike to the man's ribs, sending him stumbling backward. The second biker hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Ethan to close the gap and take him down with a crushing elbow to the jaw. He didn't stop to catch his breath. There was no time. Moving quickly, Ethan planted the smoke bomb near the rear entrance and activated it. Within seconds, a thick cloud of grey smoke billowed out, obscuring the bikers' vision and forcing them to fall back. The sound of the helicopter's rotors grew louder, and Ethan's attention snapped to the parking lot. The crate Emily had mentioned was being unloaded, 2 cartel men working methodically to haul it out of the chopper. Bulldog stood nearby, barking orders at the remaining bikers, who scrambled to regroup after the failed breach attempt. Ethan's jaw tightened. Whatever was in that crate, it couldn't be good. He had to act now, before they had a chance to deploy whatever weaponry they were planning to use. He darted back toward the front of the diner, using the cover of darkness and the chaos of the smoke to stay hidden. He reached the edge of the parking lot just as the cartel men finished unloading the crate. One of them opened it, revealing an assortment of high-powered rifles and ammunition. Bulldog grinned as he grabbed one of the weapons, his earlier frustration replaced by a sinister confidence. "This is it, boys." Bulldog roared, his voice cutting through the night. "We're taking that place apart, brick by brick. No one leaves alive." Ethan's heart pounded, but his focus remained razor-sharp. He waited until Bulldog and the others were distracted, then made his move. He launched himself toward the crate, using the element of surprise to his advantage. The first cartel man barely had time to react before Ethan slammed the steel pipe into his shoulder, disarming him and sending him sprawling to the ground. The second man reached for his weapon, but Ethan was faster, driving his elbow into the man's throat and dropping him with surgical precision. Bulldog turned, his eyes widening in shock as he saw Ethan standing over the fallen cartel men. "You," he snarled, raising his rifle. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed one of the rifles from the crate and fired a single shot, the bullet grazing Bulldog's arm and forcing him to drop his weapon. The other bikers scrambled for cover, their bravado evaporating in the face of Ethan's relentless assault. As chaos erupted in the parking lot, the helicopter began to ascend, its pilot clearly deciding that this operation was no longer worth the risk. Ethan watched as it disappeared into the night sky, taking with it the cartel's reinforcements. With the bikers in disarray and their leader wounded, the tide of the battle had turned. Ethan advanced on Bulldog, his movements deliberate and unyielding. The massive man tried to back away, clutching his injured arm, but Ethan was relentless. He grabbed Bulldog by the collar and slammed him against the side of the SUV, his voice low and deadly. "This is over," Ethan said, his steel-grey eyes boring into Bulldog's. "You tell the cartel, you tell whoever sent you this ends here. If I see you or your crew again, I won't be so generous." Bulldog glared at him, his chest heaving with rage, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He nodded reluctantly, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Ethan's presence. Ethan released him, stepping back as Bulldog slumped against the SUV. The remaining bikers hesitated, glancing between their defeated leader and the man who had brought them to their knees. One by one, they mounted their bikes and roared away into the night, leaving Bulldog and the cartel men behind. As silence finally settled over the diner, Ethan stood in the middle of the parking lot, his breath coming in slow, measured bursts. He knew this wasn't the end, not entirely. The cartel wouldn't forget this, and neither would the Iron Fangs. But for now, the fight was over. Emily emerged from the diner, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. She approached Ethan cautiously, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and awe. "You did it," she said softly. Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "For now. But this isn't over, Emily. Not by a long shot." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Together they stood in the wreckage of the night's battle, the quiet hum of the diner's flickering sign the only sound in the darkness. The first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the diner and its surrounding lot in hues of pale orange and soft gold. The chaos of the night felt surreal in the gentle morning glow, as if the violence and destruction had been nothing more than a fevered dream. But the wreckage told the truth. Broken windows, scattered debris, and scorch marks on the asphalt bore witness to the battle that had unfolded mere hours ago. Inside Mason's grill, Ethan stood in the middle of the dining room, surveying the damage with a quiet, measured gaze. His shirt was torn, and a faint bruise marred his jawline, but he moved with the steady purpose of a man who had endured worse. Around him, the diner was a shadow of its former self, tables overturned, chairs splintered, and shards of glass glittering like frost on the floor. Emily stepped cautiously out from the back room, where she had spent the final minutes of the fight monitoring the cameras and praying that Ethan would make it through. She stopped at the threshold, her breath hitching as she took in the scene. Though she had seen some of the carnage on the security feeds, seeing it in person was different. It was overwhelming. "You're alive," she said softly, her voice trembling. Ethan turned to face her, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "Takes more than that to take me down." Emily didn't return the smile. Her hands trembled as she wrapped her arms around herself, the adrenaline that had kept her steady through the night, finally giving way to the weight of it all. "This place, it's ruined. I don't even know where to start." Ethan approached her, his steps careful, deliberate. "We'll fix it," he said simply. "It'll take time, but it's not gone. Neither are you. That's what matters." Emily blinked rapidly, trying to fight back the tears threatening to spill over. "I thought you were going to die, Ethan. I don't know what I'd do if..." He placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her with his steady presence. "I'm here," he said firmly. "We're both still standing. And we made it through." She nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. For a moment they stood in silence, the enormity of what had just happened settling over them. Then, as if remembering something, Emily's eyes widened. "The cartel," she said quickly. "Bulldog, what if they come back? What if..." "They won't," Ethan interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it, a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. "Not anytime soon. They took a hit last night, one they didn't expect. Their pride's wounded, and their operation's been disrupted. They'll think twice before coming after us again." "But what if they don't?" Emily pressed. Ethan's gaze hardened. "Then they'll regret it." It wasn't a reassurance so much as a promise, and Emily found herself believing it. There was a finality in his tone, an unspoken vow that he would go to any lengths to protect what mattered. The sound of crunching gravel outside drew both their attention. Emily tensed, her heart leaping into her throat, but Ethan moved toward the window with calm precision. He peered out through the jagged remains of the glass and saw a pickup truck pulling into the lot. "It's Bill," he said, relaxing slightly. Emily frowned in confusion. "Bill Henderson." Ethan nodded. "Former ranger. I called him last night, told him we might need backup." The truck came to a stop, and a weathered man in his late 50s stepped out, his movements deliberate and measured. Bill Henderson was lean and wiry, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, but the way he carried himself made it clear that he was no stranger to danger. As Bill entered the diner, his gaze swept across the room, taking in the damage and the exhaustion etched into Ethan and Emily's faces. He gave a low whistle. "Hell of a night, I take it," he said. Ethan nodded. "We held them off. Barely." Bill's eyes narrowed. Iron Fangs? And Cartel, Ethan added. Bill let out a low growl, his jaw tightening. Figures. Those bastards been pushing into smaller towns all across the state. Looks like you gave him something to think about, though. They won't forget this, Ethan said. But we've got some breathing room for now. Bill nodded, his expression grim. You're going to need more than breathing room, though. They'll regroup eventually. You'll need to make sure this place isn't an easy target anymore. We will, Ethan said firmly. Emily looked between the two men, a question forming in her mind. Why are you here? She asked Bill. I mean, Ethan called you, but why'd you come? Bill's expression softened slightly as he turned to her. Because Ethan and I go way back, and because I don't like seeing good people get steamrolled by scum like the Iron Fangs. This place matters. You matter. That's reason enough. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tightening with emotion. Thank you, she said quietly. Bill nodded, then turned back to Ethan. What's the plan? Ethan glanced around the diner, his mind already working. We rebuild, reinforce the place, and make sure they know this isn't a soft target anymore. You've got my help, Bill said without hesitation. And mine, came a voice from the doorway. Emily turned to see another figure stepping inside, a tall woman with short cropped hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She wore a leather jacket and carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Jenny, Ethan said, a hint of surprise in his tone. Got your message late, Jenny Martinez said, setting her bag down on one of the few intact tables. Sounds like I missed the fun. Ethan smirked faintly. Plenty of cleanup left if you're interested. Jenny rolled her eyes but smiled. Wouldn't be here if I wasn't. Emily watched as more vehicles began to pull into the lot, one after another. Men and women of various ages stepped out, their movements purposeful and confident. It didn't take long to recognize the pattern. These weren't ordinary people. They were veterans, like Ethan and Bill, drawn by a shared sense of duty and loyalty. Within an hour, the diner was buzzing with activity. Broken furniture was cleared away, shattered windows were boarded up, and the remnants of the night's battle were swept into piles. Emily found herself working alongside the group, her exhaustion giving way to a sense of determination. As the day wore on, the diner began to take shape again. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was standing, a symbol of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. By evening, the group gathered outside the diner, the fading light casting long shadows across the lot. Bill and Jenny stood on either side of Ethan, while Emily lingered nearby, her arms crossed. This place is stronger than it looks, Bill said, his voice carrying a note of admiration. And so are you too. Emily glanced at Ethan, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Couldn't have done it without him. Ethan met her gaze, his expression softening. You did more than you think. Jenny stepped forward, her tone practical. We'll keep an eye on things. Spread the word that this place isn't to be messed with. The Iron Fangs will think twice before trying anything again. Ethan nodded, his gratitude unspoken but clear. Thank you, all of you. As the group began to disperse, returning to their vehicles and heading back to their own lives, Emily and Ethan stood together in the quiet lot. The neon sign above the diner flickered faintly, its light a reminder that, despite everything, Mason's Grill was still here. What now? Emily asked, her voice soft. Ethan glanced at her, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. Now we keep moving forward. Together. Emily nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that they could face whatever came next. As the last of the vehicles disappeared into the night, the two of them turned toward the diner, ready to begin the long process of rebuilding not just the place, but the sense of peace and safety it represented. Together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, one step at a time,